So welcome everyone to Data Founders, an interview series where we talk with data science startup founders, executives, and experts. We're also about to launch a mentoring program this year, so stay tuned. And today our guest is Tomás Sabat, who is a co-founder and chief operating officer at Grakn Labs. And what Grakn does, the guys, they build a knowledge graph, a database to organize complex networks of data and make it queryable. It's a pleasure to have you here, Tomás.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Peter.
Fantastic. So to kick off, I'd ask you to introduce yourself a bit and also tell us a bit more about Grakn.
Sure. So my name is Tomás. As you mentioned, I work as a founder and chief operating officer at Grakn. In a nutshell, I oversee the business side of things at Grakn, and then Heiko, who's the original technical founder, oversees the product. So that's kind of how we divide the responsibilities here at Grakn. I guess in a very brief nutshell, but me, I've done a lot of very different things. I think in my very short background, I'm half Dutch, half Chilean. I was born in Chile and then moved to the Netherlands before coming to the UK. But I started a few businesses before doing Grakn, but actually I studied politics. So I don't actually have I don't really come from tech per se, but I dabbled in different interests. And I guess that's one of my I don't know what the right word is, but there's a lot of things in life that interests me. And I think that's something we can talk about. I think one of the beauties of entrepreneurship is that you get to express yourself in all those different interests, that innate curiosity that life gives you.
Yeah. And what about Grakn? What life gives to Grakn, or what Grakn does give to life?
Yes, well, I like to start really high level, because I think what we do, the way we do it is, or what we do is one thing, but the purpose and the impact of what that has in the world is something so much greater. And one of the really fundamental things we have to remember for us as a company is that when you think of innovation, or when you think of the purpose of computer science in the world, how does it move us? How does it move humanity? How does it push us forward? One of the most powerful ways of how it does that is by creating abstraction layers, specifically abstraction layers in programming languages. What does that mean? That means that when we create an abstraction layer in a programming language, we enable new groups of people to be productive and build software that previously they could have built. And that's really important, because as we've evolved in the computer science industry, we've gone from very low-level languages like assembly, which are extremely complex languages for most developers to use, to something so high-level like Python, which is a relatively very simple language to use. And there's a lot of operations that have been abstracted away. So we can build things like self-driving cars or find new drugs, and really the bane of human existence right now, to a large extent, is built on Python and other languages, of course, as well. But when we look at the database space, something very interesting is the last time we created a real abstraction layer at the database was back in the 70s, when we introduced the relational theory that then became the basis for relational databases. And since then, most, if not all, of the innovation in the database space has been around scalability. So how do we serve data or databases to thousands of users at the same time, which still engineering-wise is a huge problem to solve. But when you look at the data that software uses today, there's so much complexity in the data that we do require a new way of handling that data, both from a representational point of view as from a querying point of view. And in a nutshell, that's what we solve. And the way we do it is by building, as you pointed just now, is by building a knowledge graph. So we use the terms interchangeably with the knowledge base. And so here, a knowledge base, the difference with the database is that we're storing knowledge instead of data. And then knowledge here we define as being contextualized data. So data that has been reasoned over, that has been contextualized. And an example of what that means is if I ask you, who is my aunt, if I first give you two facts, if I tell you my father is Bob, And I also tell you my father Bob has a sister Susan. If I now ask you who's my aunt, then, well, as a human, you would know that the answer is Susan, without me having to actually explain you that particular piece of information. And a database can't do that because a database can't reason over your data. But that's the intelligence that we give to the database. Now, that example, of course, is a very simple one at that level, but imagine working at a much higher scale with 10 hops or 1,000 different relations that we want to reason over, millions or billions. And I guess as a final point, we see a product is open source. We, of course, have a commercial version as well, but we see a lot of use cases in particular in the life sciences, so things like drug discovery, but also a lot in the cybersecurity space, and including finance, e-commerce, data management, robotics even, which is quite an exciting one, I should say, and really any industry that works with complex data.
Cool, I see. And before we dive into some details of doing business and startups, I wanted maybe to talk a bit more about the role that Chief Operating Officer plays in the company. I guess you are the first COO among our guests. The majority of people were either investors or CEOs, Chief Executive Officers. So tell us a bit more about the role of COO. What is it actually about?
Yeah. So I think there's a couple of things first to note. Of course, there's the official description, I guess, that the market would give to a COO. Ultimately, though, it will depend. What's the type of relationship you have with your co-founder, with your partner? How do you divide responsibilities, and then what's the title that you give to each other? In our case, the way we do it, me and Heiko. So Heiko has the technical vision. So the product, where we're going as a company, that's on Heiko. And of course, we do that together, but from a product standpoint, the Grakn really was Heiko's brainchild. So the language, all of that, that's on Heiko, and then he's responsible for the delivery of the product itself. Now, that's his main focus, and then my focus is everything else. So that means finance, that means investment, that means sales, that means marketing, that means, well, operations. That means making sure the fridge is fully stocked, making sure the cleaners come on time. And now, of course, that doesn't mean that we don't work together. Heiko and I work very closely as much as we need to when it comes to the investment, when it comes to anything really. But the goal here is trying to div up the responsibilities and then making sure that the company understands on how we divide responsibility. So that's how we've done it at Grakn. I've seen other companies where there may be a CTO role that is delegated on the role that Heiko does, and then the CEO does the more operational role. I think maybe I'm biased, but the way we've done it, I think, is the right way, because especially for a company that works with where we're so deeply technical, ultimately it needs to be technology driven. So having a technical CEO that's also in charge of the product and also codes, Heiko still codes every single day, is, I think, so important. We've made a lot of mistakes. So everything I'm saying is because we've made a gazillion mistakes over the last 5 years. But I think it's so important that at the CEO level, there's just an obsessive focus on product, on delivery, because it just takes such a long time to build. And especially if you want to change the world in the way that we want to, in the way that we think we will do, you have to be obsessive and you have to put product first, and everything else will follow from that. I think there's a great book that I think a lot of founders know. It's called The Score Settles Itself, from Bill Walsh, one of the most famous football coaches in the world, and I think football is in American football. And he's all about, what's this, building the system, and then the score will settle itself. And I think with a deeply technical product company like what we are, it's very, very much like that as well. I'm not trying to say that the product will sell itself, by no means, but there has to be an obsessive obsessive focus on product, just like Apple or any great company really has.
Yes, yes, I see. So you think that there is a different types of CEOs roles, I mean, depending on what kind of company somebody builds. So if it's a deep tech company, then CEO takes more technology and product together, and then all remaining things move to operating office, right? If it's not deep tech, maybe there might be some other principles.
I think so. I don't want to really express a template that anyone should follow. I think ultimately really that boils down into what's, as a founder, as a management, as a manager, as an executive, what's the role that you have with your founder, with your co-founders. And ultimately that's what will determine how you divide responsibilities and what roles you give yourself. But I think realizing that the product, especially if you're a deep technology company, the product really comes first, and having and not delegating, especially in the early, well, I think maybe never, the product to let's say a lead engineer or a secondary CTO that's outside of the real core founders team. Delegating that can be very dangerous. And honestly, I say that because again, we've made those mistakes, and keeping that with the founding team just makes sure that there's an obsessive focus on excellence. Not because others can't do it, but simply because they don't have the same emotional attachment to the product. And so I think that's just so important if you're starting out.
Yes, yes, I see. And you mentioned multiple times how important it is to have this tight co-founding team. And if I'm correct, you joined Grakn a bit later, right? It was like a year into founding. So I guess you may backsolve it a bit and tell us how somebody can find a co-founding CEO, or sorry, COO. If somebody is deeply technical, let's say researcher or engineer, so how he or she can find a person like you to help with operations and at the same time to be at the same co-founding level?
Yeah, I get this. Honestly, I get this question asked many times. I don't have an answer. I'll be honest with you. The answer that I give when this, and the same is true for business people that have an answer, but they don't have, that have an idea for a business, but they can't find a technical person, and to them technology is like speaking Chinese. The answer that I give is you just gotta be out there. You gotta be talking about what you want to do. You gotta be hustling. You gotta be in this. People need to know what you want from life, what you want to accomplish. You know, in my case, when I met Heiko, I was doing my third company. The second one never took off because I had a fallout with what would have become my co-founder and the investor there as well. So I came off the back with quite a bit of experience from a really a founding perspective. My first co-founder is very similar to me. It worked well, but you learn that it's so important to have someone that's so different to you. And the second person I was working with, he was a bit very emotional. I respect him a lot. I really don't want to speak ill, but there's a lot that you learn when you have those experiences. And then when I was doing my third company, actually in that case, I wasn't a programmer, and I ended up just teaching myself how to code. So I ended up spending 6 months just coding 15 hours a day, trying to build a product that I could put out there and show to people. At the same time, I was looking for a technical co-founder. Actually, I couldn't really find one, but I didn't want to sit still. So I just wanted to get out there, build a product, speak to investors, speak to clients. Most importantly, speak to clients, get people to pay. And if there's someone that you want as a partner, I think something really important that some founders perhaps don't realize, it's not a transactional either. It's someone that may be as important, or maybe almost as important as someone that you're marrying. It's someone that you're going on a journey that is going to be very long. If you're in it for real, it's something that you need to have a relationship that is one of the most complicated that you will ever have. And you can't just find that someone transactionally. It's something that will happen whenever it happens. But I think, so there's some luck involved, but you can still engineer luck by showing up, by being present, by hustling, by being out there. So my advice is always just start. Start building your product. Even if you're not not a programmer, just start building something. And I mean, it sounds horrible, or it sounds not very actionable, but it will happen by just, I guess, engineering serendipity in that sense. In our case, my housemates in Cambridge, when I was studying there, were in the same course as my partner was. And when I was doing what I was doing, that's why I was on Facebook. Someone introduced me to Heiko. My housemates introduced me to Heiko, simply because he saw what I was doing and he knew what Heiko was doing. And he's like, okay, these two people should meet because they're doing quite similar things. Now, if I hadn't been doing what I was doing, there was no way my friend would have made that introduction. And by the way, at the time, that was just a beer that we had in Brewdog. But for me, that was so inspirational because it was really, really tough for me doing that. I think in my second or third month doing that particular project. I was alone. I was just, I was really kind of pushing. It was very no money really. And Heiko, there's someone that you need that's at the same level that you are on, and so you feel inspired to push on. So that was a great meeting. But it was only a while after that Heiko asked if I was interested, if I would consider it, because he also knew that I was doing my thing, and he didn't want to ask in the beginning as well. And yeah, it's serendipitously, but still, again, if I hadn't been hustling and just in the grind, Heiko would have never also even considered it. So, and I would, that's the biggest advice that I would give to anyone.
Yeah. And were you doing your thing full time before when you met Heiko?
Yes, absolutely.
I think about that. It's a question frequently people ask, like, shall I leave my job and do startups, or like I need to combine them? What's your view?
My personal view, and I'm very obsessive, I think if you can sleep on a couch, if you're okay spending as little money as possible, you don't need much money really to survive. In my case, I actually moved out of London. I moved to my mother's house in the Netherlands, and I was just in the upstairs room just coding. I did it, and I went to London a couple of times. I did a few. The nice thing is, because I taught myself how to code, I got a little bit of money that I did from projects that some friends gave me. They needed this website here and there, and I could build something in like a day or so. And that gave me some money that I could use to just pay for travel to the UK, or just kind of just live and stay alive. And so yes, I think for some people, especially if you're building product, do you really need to be in London? Do you really need to pay the rent? Are there places where you can go where you can really decrease your spend? And you have to be obsessive about this. And I think one of the things that is true about people coming from, let's say, a comfortable background, especially in Western Europe or the US, is that this refugee mentality, the survival mentality, that you strip off of everything that you don't really need. Like that level of obsessiveness, that's what I think really distinguishes from people that really make it and people that don't. Because I mean, this is really hard to do. And if you do it properly and at a large scale, VC backed and all, it's tough. And ultimately, for most companies for a lot of companies that make it, is because they just didn't give up, and they kept on trying, and they kept pushing, and last man or woman standing. And we've had some very harsh times ourselves, and luckily we're now at a really, really good place. But a while back it was very different, and there will be more tough times. But frankly, this is what makes, I would say, it's what makes life exhilarating. In some ways, I really miss the bad times. The bad times is what makes you feel alive. When you're in it, it's slightly tougher. But in hindsight, it's what makes you feel alive. And when everything's going great, you're just waiting for something to go wrong. But that's why I really don't recommend people starting companies, because you have to be crazy to do it. But if you really don't have any other choice, then it's for you. But the idea that you have to become a founder to do something great is I think a fallacy that so many people fall into, that they don't have to. You can do great things by not being a founder. And well, of course, and the other thing is, of course, you don't really have to be a VC-backed company. That's the other fallacy that most people have, that you have to raise VC funds, when actually there's a lot of great businesses that can either sustain themselves, you sell product, you sell services, and you don't need VC because VC is a very, very specific asset class that most founders don't really understand when they start out.
Yeah, a lot of things to unpack there. We'll probably take them one by one, but just a couple other questions regarding the initial stages of your journey, startup journey. When you were about to start what you have been doing, and also when you were about to join Grakn, how close it was actually to your background, to your expertise? Because frequently, again, we hear a question like, do I need to start a startup adjacent to what I do? Or maybe I can do a startup in biotechnology, but I haven't done biotechnology at all. I'm a data scientist, kind of generalist, let's call it. What's your view here?
Yeah, I am absolutely not in. I'm adamant that anyone can learn anything. There's businesses that I want to start that I have no clue about, but I'm just obsessive about that particular space. I think, I mean, to your question, I come from a political background. I studied international politics. I have no background in technology. Frankly, when I joined Grakn, I didn't really know what databases were about. I had used them, heavily abstracted away through kind of ORMs and stuff like that. Just abstraction layers, so you don't have to touch the database necessarily. But a few years down the line, I know more than most people in the industry, and it's simply because I think it's a mix of curiosity, obsessiveness, and also, and this is actually, I just read a book on this. It's called Range. I highly recommend it. I saw it on Bill Gates' book, and it's an incredibly interesting book because it's a big criticism on society's current obsession on hyper specialization. Kids are encouraged from a very early age to go into one field, one sector. What the book argues instead is that although it's not to say that we don't need specialists, it's to say that actually some of the greatest inventions in the world are because people have such mixed backgrounds. Roger Federer is a great example. He actually, I don't remember the exact, but the first time he really started to play tennis was very late in his teens, and he did a lot of different sports, which is different to someone like Tiger Woods, who played golf from a very, very early age. But life is not like golf, which is a very controlled environment where we're understanding one specific skill, which is just putting the ball in the putt. You can train over and over again. Whereas life consists of what is in the science called wicked challenges, which is challenges that you can't really train for. Where being able to make 4 analogies is one of the greatest assets you can have. So if I have experience in industry X and I go into industry Y, even though I may not be an expert in industry Y, there's a lot of analogies that I may be able to make from X to Y. And that will allow me to innovate in industry Y, will allow me to see things that people can't see if they're in industry Y, and ultimately build great businesses. So I think the role of the entrepreneur especially is to be able to do that. Because you can hire the experts, you can hire people to do the details. You can hire, if you have a vision that you want to execute, you work with people that know the details, but being able to think at that really high level is something really unique for that is hard for people that are too specialized in one field to do. And you see this a lot in biology. I think, there's people that are so specialized in one specific cell type that if they have to discuss things with another group that specializes in a very similar but different cell type, there's very little overlap in those two fields. And biology is particularly notorious about this, especially lately. There's been a lot of criticism that we need more kind of lateral thinking and more range in people and more generalists, more generalists. And that's, I think, also the policy that we as a company want to follow, and you see this a lot with some of the other companies as well. Hiring generalists is such a good thing to do for a company for many different things. So no, I'm super interested in biotech. I mean, we do a lot in biotech right now, as I mentioned before, and I have no experience in that, but you can learn these things. You read the books, you talk to people. The world's a beautiful place. It's a shame there's only 24 hours a day, but there's just so many exciting things out there. And yeah.
True. And I wanted to touch base on an interesting point you kind of touched also is, let's call it maybe delegation and maybe outsourcing, something like that. And I would love to discuss a particular angle, exactly sales. There is a lot of debates about founder-led sales and who needs to do actually sales. What's your approach in Grakn, and what's your approach in general? What do you think about who actually does sales, especially at the early stage? Let's call it early stages, before A, maybe maximum A stage, something like that.
Yeah. No, I would insist the founder, someone on the founder's team needs to lead that. It's you can't delegate that. Again, I speak here from having made mistakes in our past. I would insist as a founder, you need to leading those sales. Not all the founders, but someone on the founding team to lead those sales. And simply because you may not, you may not be an expert salesperson and know all the fancy, acronyms and all the fancy sales processes and the reporting mechanisms. But there's no one better placed. There's no one you can hire who can sell the vision, who can sell the passion, who can sell themselves, because ultimately the early stage product, the early stage customers, just like the early stage investors, are going to buy into you, perhaps as much as the product, because you're making promises also about the future, how the future should look like. So you need to lead that, whether it's 5, 10, 20, I think that depends on the type of product that you're selling. If it's a very heavy, enterprise, low volume, then 1, 2, 3 maybe. But if it's a bit more than that, then 5 or 10. But definitely there needs to be at some point where you feel comfortable that what you've sold is repeatable, and the conversation that you're having start to become the same, and you're not learning as much anymore from the conversations. And at that point, you can really start to standardize it, because then you have really clear vision and idea of how the process should be, and then you can really delegate that to someone who can really take that and they can really add value by standardizing it, creating the process, the right reporting mechanisms. That's what you're paying for when you're hiring these people, and that's what they bring to the table in addition to their sales skills, their qualification skills. But no, I would insist founders should really lead the first couple of sales. If you don't, and just like with the product, if you get someone in too early, there's a less drive to push that. And also, as a final point, the benefit of having the founders or one of the founders lead those early sales is that the relationships that you will have with those customers will be of a very different nature, and they may be willing to do things that otherwise they wouldn't be able to do, which is recommending you to other of their customers or of their friends at other companies, become advocates for your technology, and that's definitely how I try to approach a lot of how we do here at Grakn. That every interaction that we have, since we're open source, our sales aren't just about the product, about getting the money, but it's first and foremost about getting people to use the product.
Yeah. And
that's just, we want everyone, even non-sales targets, to just really fall in love with the product. And we want them to have an emotive reaction when they talk to us, when they interact with us. Any type of contact they have with us, it needs to be more than just a transactional back and forth.
Interesting. And I would like to use an opportunity to talk to you as with someone who learned a lot of technical things, to maybe use this experience and to talk a bit more about how someone technical can learn non-technical things. So you made this very interesting journey. You started to code, you code it like 15 hours a day. So you understand how difficult it is to learn something which is absolutely outside of your expertise, absolutely outside of your experience. So imagine there is a founder, again, quite technically heavy, and who, for whatever reason, doesn't have an operating officer or a commercial guy in his co-founding team. How he or she can maybe learn, stretch himself or herself to deal with customers, to make these first discussions, maybe close first bunch of sales. What could be the most important mechanisms or hacks or suggestions?
Yeah. I think the first thing that comes to mind, which is it's not a very actionable one, so I don't know how helpful it is, but I think it's a very important one, is you have to respect the work and you have to be curious about it, and you need to want to do it, and you really need to want to do it. It shouldn't be something like a chore. And I say that because when you really want something, you're gonna find a way to learn it. And so by doing and by setting yourself that goal, you'll pick up the right books, you'll speak to the right people, but with a very humble mindset and trying to really learn, and then go out there and execute. And then it's just a matter of trial and error. I think the nice thing about especially on the sales side is that you can send 100 cold emails and pitch whoever responds to those emails, and you're going to fail many times. But and especially as an engineer, that's hard to, one of the things that I think engineers struggle to appreciate is that sales is a very lonely job sometimes, because you get a lot of rejections. But going through that process of rejection, okay, next rejection, next rejection, next, and then just iterating on that. And as long as you're obsessive about being excellent in doing that, and I really mean obsessive, you cannot be anything less, then you'll get there. And it's a process, and it'll take time, and I think patience there is really, really important. And I think then it's possible. I don't like to use the term anything is possible as long as you work for it, because that's such a cliche. Because ultimately you do want to, you need to want it. And again, I don't want to say that's all there is to do, but that's as much as you can do. There's nothing else, right? We can never be perfect, but we can strive to be to perfection every single day. That's as much as we can do. But yeah, in terms of actionable steps, I think go on LinkedIn. LinkedIn has a great function where you can send a note, add a note to an invite. You send an invite to people you want to meet. You add you iterate on different messages you can add to those notes. Keep them short. I would say 1 or 2 sentences, and see who comes back. And make sure your LinkedIn profile is interesting. People want to talk to you, especially if you're a technical founder. People will want to talk to you because they're interested in your sexy technology. And then just pitch and build those relationships, and be upfront also about what you're doing, I think. Yeah, those are some things I would think about.
That's cool. That's super valuable and actionable things. And sometimes, especially at early stages, the sales process goes hand in hand with the customer development process as well.
Right. Yeah.
Was it your case when you joined Grakn, or customer development was mostly done when you joined?
Well, the thing about our case is, I guess we're slightly different to most companies, because the customer that we're selling to is the same customer, is the same type of people that we are. So because we are developers, as a company, we are a we're a technology company. So the people that would be using Grakn are similar to us. Now, that's not to say that there isn't some customer development that we didn't have to do. The core has always remained the same. Again, the core has never changed, because especially where Heiko is coming from, he worked in an optimization scheduling company. He would have been a customer of Grakn. So the main message, the main core value proposition has never changed. What has changed, and this is especially true if you're a platform company, where the value proposition will be different to each industry. The core may be the same, but how is that valuable to industry X will differ to industry Y. What we did in our case, because we invented a new language, a new way of doing things, is that there is some translation that we need to do in different industries. And so we chose life sciences as one industry to look at specifically. And so, to be frank, I just went out on LinkedIn and I just reached out to a lot of people, and I had a lot of calls. And when I say a lot of calls, I mean 10, 15 calls a day for many days in a row over a couple of weeks. And you learn, and people tell you things, and you learn what works, what doesn't, and you read papers and you iterate on that. And I guess those, in some sense, are customer interviews. My view on customer interviews is, I don't think they're necessarily not useful, but I think if you go into them with the mindset of selling to them, it's just a very different mindset. Because if you're just interviewing them, people can tell you anything that what they want, but will they part with money? Sometimes they themselves don't know, and they'll, you know, they're nice to you. They want to be nice to you, and so really trying to get them to spend money or time with your product is the key indicator whether you're going in the right direction or not.
And I'm sure you know about the great book, The Mom's Test, about customer interviews, but maybe you have some set of questions or maybe some set of themes that you would suggest as interesting ones to discuss during the interviews. What shouldn't be missed there, definitely?
I think for me, it's what I just said. I mean, what does it take for them to pay you money? What does it take for them to spend their, actually, to be fair, not just money, but also time. So if you have a product, what would it take for them to really spend time and money on doing what you have? Now, of course, now I appreciate that's a bit more difficult when you don't have something, when you don't have a product. But I would still insist, try and find a way to get them to prepay something. If you don't have a product, then tell them, you know, you're going to have something in 6 months' time. Would you be willing to pay me X? Fully refundable if you don't get it in 6 months' time. But is this something that you would pay for? Because that's the ultimate truth teller. And I say that because, you know, as entrepreneurs and in this industry, everyone is giving you advice. Everyone will tell you what to do. You should hire this person. You should, this is how you should do your company. And the thing you learn, I think, as you do this over time, is to filter what advice is actual valuable advice. And many times the advice is genuine and is valuable, but the context at which you apply it is different, and the timing is different. And the same is true with customer interviews. People will tell you what they want, but actually, you know, most customers don't actually know what they want. And the interesting thing about us being open source is that we have a barrage of people telling what they want from the product because it is open source. So it's not just customers. And so we've developed, I mean, we're constantly learning, but definitely we've I think developed a very thick skin to, I mean, first say no to things, but actually more, and I do this a lot with people, is that when they say they need something, I will tell them, actually, I don't think you need that because you can do X, Y, and Z. So why do you need this? I mean, sure, it would be nice, but do you really need it to proceed? And then they understand. So but you only can get that by really understanding your customer, and that just comes from just doing a lot of different meetings.
Great. Let's switch gears and talk about open source. Sure. That's a very hot topic right now, and really it affects, I mean, the open source model affects everything: customer development, sales processes, etc. Since a lot of potential founders are listening, I guess we can start from thinking about what actually can be open sourced, where open source model is a good one, and where maybe you shouldn't think about that. So what's your framework, or maybe what's your advice on that?
Yeah, I think, you know, first is, in some sense, it's the context in which you operate. So what's the industry, who are you targeting? Because, and also, how big do you want your company to be? And it's easier, especially if you're selling to developers. If you really want to be big, if you want to be a, you know, MongoDB style, Elasticsearch, Docker, Snowflake type, open source gives you a huge opportunity to really become big in a way that is much harder to do if you're just selling for the enterprise. So there's a couple of considerations to be made there, starting with what is your company, and then it comes down to what part of your product you make open source. Now, I think one of the lessons from the past 10 years, especially those companies that have failed and have succeeded, have IPO'd, is that it's very dangerous to start with putting everything in the open source. Because once you, let's say you have some traction in the open source that is validating your product, how do you then get them to pay for the commercial version, which is the model that everyone seems to be, you know, focusing on, the third, I think someone called it the third generation of open source, or the open core model. And there's a couple of companies that have gone public that have faced those situations where the open source product was so good, and when they started to commercialize and they brought in the salespeople, the only thing they competed on really was the open source. So I think from day one, and I think that's so important, from day one, having a clear idea, what's the difference between your enterprise product or commercial product, and the open source. And both open source as well as what goes in the cloud as a SaaS offering. And so, and that requires, of course, a good understanding of the customer, which comes over time. The main thing you shouldn't do is to start with everything open source and then maybe taking out some of those features and putting in the commercial version. It sounds so it sounds going against common sense, but there's a few companies that have tried that. And if you have a community that cares about your product, they are going to be so pissed off. And so you cannot close source anything that you open source unless you want a backlash. That's why you have to be very careful in the beginning. What do you make open source? And so the strategy that we took is that all of the innovation that we're doing, from the reasoning, the language, the server, is open source. So you can really try the software in a very extensive way. But then when we closed source is things like clustering, high availability, security. So our distinction is really production grade features go closed source. And the reason here is that a business that will launch Grakn in production, that will derive business value from it, they need certain types of features. And those are the ones that we would ask people to pay for. All the rest, the fancy stuff, the new stuff, the sexy, the new tech stuff, all of that goes in the open source. And that's the first entry point that someone tries our software with.
Got it. And super important part of the open source model, and even not only open source model, is the community and the culture. So probably before we close, I wanted to talk a bit more about them. So let's first talk about the culture in the company, and then about the community as an open source community. What do you think, as operating officer, what are the most important components of that culture and what it actually is? Because again, sometimes people with technical mindsets, they obsessed with the code, with the product, and human stuff goes somewhere, or the peripheral vision. So what they definitely need to pay attention to?
Internal, within the company, you mean?
Within internal company culture, because culture is a very wide definition, right? Everything is a culture. Beer-pong is a culture. The way how I write email also is a culture. So imagine a technical founder, maybe the most important bits of that culture, he or she needs to pay attention to.
So when it comes to open source, especially, so is your question specifically related to open source?
Right now about the internal culture within the company, deep tech company, doesn't matter open source or not. And then we talk about open source community.
Yeah. So, well, I mean, this is a huge topic, of course, but I think if you're a founder, it's the realization that your personality is the company's culture, and being comfortable with that. So there's a lot of kind of internal personality things that you need to understand of yourself first, and then being very open about it. Being very open about how you want the company to be, how you want people to behave. And by the way, I think Ben Horowitz did a good, he published a good book, I think last July. I forgot the name, but he wrote a book just on culture. And it is really about understanding, what is your personality? How do you want the company to be? And then every single one of your actions, however small, will really become the culture. So if things as small as making sure the dishes are, people put their dishes, you have to do that. If you don't do that, people are not going to do that. If you want people to, segregate recyclables and general waste, you have to make sure that you do it yourself. There's no room for not doing that, because whatever you do, people will follow. And actually there's another great book by Coach Wooden, who's one of the most famous basketball coaches out there. He wrote a good book on leadership that I would also recommend, Coach Wooden. And he's very adamant about these small little details. So when he's coaching his team, he will insist that you put the towel, you fold it. When you've used the towel, you fold it and you put it away. Because for him, the way you do one thing means how you do everything. So making sure that everything that all these small little actions, and the reason I'm focusing on the small things is because the small things is one, but then the bigger ones is the ones we usually focus on. All these small little things in aggregate determine so much of how the company becomes, from coming on time, or what's the policy of coming on time. But again, the focus on behavior. And then I think the second point that I would make here is to be really obsessive about coaching. Mm-hmm. And be very open also about speaking about the role of coaching. So we do really our best to make sure that everyone we bring into the company is coachable. Especially if you're recruiting and hiring very smart people, that's sometimes difficult because everyone has an ego. Everyone thinks they're smart. Mm-hmm. But we are looking for some sort of intellectual humility to make sure that people are coachable and are open to improve, and the role of coaching in that is so important. But that's also part of the culture. You may choose to have a culture that doesn't value coaching itself. I would say that's a mistake, but that ultimately that's the founder's decision. But yeah, I think I would insist, the articulation of your own personality as a founder ultimately is what will determine the culture of the company. And then having people around you that can really perpetuate that, because you have the founding team that sets that initial culture, and then you have the first tier of people that join afterwards. They will be perhaps not as invested as the first tier, but certainly heavily invested. And then you have the outer layers, making sure how does everyone stick the same. And actually, as a final point, Reed Hastings wrote his first book in September, I think, last year. I would highly recommend it. They're also they have a very interesting take on culture, very, very impressive as well. Mm-hmm. And yeah, I would also recommend that book on their take on their culture.
Awesome. And one specific element of culture I'm interested in, especially in relationship to deep tech companies. I don't know how to call it properly. Maybe it's agility. What I'm saying is that in deep tech, or maybe just in infrastructural tech, things take a lot of time. So you guys 5 years old, right? You build, you expand your community, you build your product. It all takes time. There are some other sectors when you have very quick growth, for instance, like in consumer space, app store, billions of installs, whatever.
Yeah.
How a team may ensure that people remain they remain believing into something across the very long distances, because it's a marathon, especially in enterprise software, in infrastructure software. It's not a sprint. So what do you have any maybe experience or maybe reflections on that?
Yeah, I think it comes down to, first, who are you hiring? Ultimately, recruitment is the bane of everything. So in our case is we want to make sure that the people we hire are really purposeful in the lives that they choose to lead. By being purposeful, that means that they're doing something because they believe that what they're doing has some sort of meaning that is purposeful to them on a personal level. That may differ from people to people, but ultimately the company becomes the sum of all of these different visions and purposes put together around the company's vision. And so having a really good understanding of what that is for everyone as you build a company, and then having the right processes in place to make sure that recruitment keeps happening at the right level and that never ever goes down. I think it all starts with that, because you cannot build a company with the wrong people. And frankly, especially in the early stages, if you're blitz scaling, it's particularly hard. But you will pay the price later if you don't weed out the people that do not conform or aren't compatible, I should say, to the culture of the company. That will damage the company in the long run, because people will influence their own space, especially if they join at an early stage, even however smart they are. So yeah, I think recruitment is extremely important. But then the other thing is just being adamant about the vision and the purpose why we're here as a group of people, and having stories that people can believe in. I think stories are very powerful. And I think there's two types of stories. One is a story about the vision the company has. So what are we trying to do? What does the world look like because of us? And the second is stories from what happened in the company. So a story can be something that, person X was let go because of X, Y, and Z. that's a story that determines the culture of the company. Stories, that's a story that people will tell each other when they, when someone joins or whenever that comes up in casual conversation. Stories about the fact that someone got a promotion because they did something. All these small little things ultimately grow into becoming the narrative that becomes the idea that is something bigger than just the day to day. And as we saw from well, I mean, this is very political, but an idea is ultimately the most powerful thing that we can have. So if we can get these ideas out there in the form of stories, which is really the most powerful way of remembering these ideas, there's a lot of control that we can maintain in making sure that the culture stays the right one.
I guess that's a very powerful moment maybe to move to the close. We have lots of questions. You have seen the list in the community, it's like almost 100. But just to be the caution of your time, maybe the last question, maybe we missed something. If there is any topic or theme or a question that we didn't discuss, but you believe it should be discussed, we can talk about that if you want.
Well, I mean, I'd like to say that I think life is a very amazing thing. The fact that we are alive, and I wish people took note of that and would be grateful for just that simple fact. And the reason I say that, because and it's especially true for entrepreneurs, but not just for entrepreneurs, for anyone that wants to do something with their lives that means something to them, is not to take that for granted, because we're here for only a very short period of time. And what do we do? And actually, also very important, who do we do it with? I guess as a founder, you get to choose a lot who do you want to do it with, and that's your responsibility, not a privilege, I would say. But just being very cognizant of the fact that that there's so much we can do in life, and we live in an age where there's so many opportunities for us to choose our own paths, virus or not. The virus is extremely tragic, and there's so much hardship, but that in itself gives also purpose and meaning to people that can do something, that want to do something. And I say this especially for which I think you as well see, I'm sure, people that very bright people going straight out of university, being attracted by the salaries that the big tech in particular pay these days, and in my view could have done things much better for society. That's not to judge them, but that's just to say that there's such a big pull from these corporations that there's more than just life than that. And I guess to close, there's one very, very bright guy that we wanted to hire. We spent a lot of time, 10 hours or so, just with this one person going through interviews. And when we were getting to kind of the close and the offer, his parents ultimately pressurized him to take the job at Facebook, who was paying more, not that much more, because, well, there wasn't an appreciation, actually an understanding of really what options meant. But also the role that we understood at Facebook was in my view, such a purposeless role in terms of what they were actually doing in terms of optimizing ads or something like that. Whereas, especially if you're in a startup, you get the chance to really do something great and do something great with the world, whatever that means to you. And I just wish more people would realize that life is great, and it's only great if we choose it to be great. I don't want to sound too simplistic, but I hope people understand what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I guess that's a great final remarks, and partially why we do that is because we believe that there are many different options, and we try to give a platform for people to share the experience like you did right now, and to show and to demonstrate that there are many options available, and to help potential founders to select between these options. So thank you very much, Tomás, once again.
Thank you.
I'm sure we'll hear a lot of good news from you and from Grakn in the future.
Thank you so much, Peter. I appreciate the time. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.